Dear students, welcome to this module. I am Dr. Tilagmani from Department of Food Service Management Dietetics of Avinashlingam University, and welcome to this e-Pathshala module. Now you have chosen to learn about glycemic index, glycemic load and non-nutritive sweeteners in this module. In this session, before we go on in detail on these topics, let me tell you that this glycemic index and glycemic load is a relatively new concept that has been in practice for more than 2 decades. It has assumed a great significance because of its importance in management of both health and disease. Glycemic index, as we know, is a measurement carried out on carbohydrate containing foods and their impact on our blood glucose levels, that is the blood sugar. Glycemic index is relatively a new way of analyzing the foods, with most meals designed to improve the blood glucose analyze the total amount of carbohydrates, which includes all types of sugars and starches in the foods themselves. Glycemic index goes beyond this approach, looking exactly at the impact of foods on our actual blood glucose levels. In other words, instead of counting the total amount of carbohydrates in the meal, it is enough that we go on to measure the actual impact of these foods on the blood glucose levels in the individuals. Now, when we look into the overall objective of this module, which is divided into 3 subheads, it will enable you, the learners, to know the relationship that exists between the index and the load in the individuals, and also understand the concept of glycemic load of the foods. And on the later part, it is to know the effect of the non-nutritive sweeteners in health management. Now, when we look into glycemic index, the history of the index, in 1981, Jenkins defined the glycemic index for the first time as a rank differently dietary carbohydrates on their ability to raise blood glucose levels as compared with a reference food. For example, studies have suggested that the glycemic index of diet has a predictable effect on blood glucose levels and may have use in the dietary management of diabetes mellitus and as well hyperlipidemia, where we have the lipoproteins in higher levels. There are significant data indicating slowly absorbed starchy foods, that is, those with a low glycemic index may have a health advantage over those with a high glycemic index. However, the Institute of Medicine declined to set an upper limit, which is UL, for the glycemic index in its 2002 recommendations. Compelling reasons were that data from healthy individuals were not adequate and that it is difficult to separate other factors that may contribute to the blood glucose levels from the effect of the glycemic index. For example, when we look into the beneficial effects of dietary fiber on blood glucose levels, which are well established, certainly fiber is known to decrease the glycemic index. The median fiber intake of Americans is only half of the average recommendations of the healthy individuals. And now when we look into how this glycemic index is classified, it is classified as low, medium and high. So the low levels include the glycemic index 55 or lesser, and when we go into the next category of medium index foods, it is between 56 and 69, and the high glycemic index are rated more than 70. And now we will have to know why glycemic index and need for this glycemic index. Glycemic index is a valuable nutrition education tool in a number of areas of clinical nutrition, manipulating the food choices to lower the glycemic index of the diet, and has shown to improve the blood glucose control in diabetes and also to reduce the high blood lipid levels. Application of these glycemic index foods may be useful also in sports nutrition to optimize the carbohydrate availability for exercise, and that can be particularly useful for sports activities involving prolonged moderate intensity exercises and endure the sports performance. Different foods have different effects on the blood glucose levels depending on how the digestibility of starch happens in the food and its interaction of the starch with protein in the food and the amount and kind of fats, sugars and fiber which is available in the meal, and also the presence of other constituents that bind starch in the form of food, for example dry paste or liquid form, or whenever it is coarsely or finely ground, how thoroughly it is cooked, and these combination of foods consumed at a given time also affects the glycemic index. The glycemic load is a way of expressing the impact of carbohydrates consumed on the body, which reflects how the blood glucose levels will change after the ingestion of a food, beverage or a meal. If an athlete eats only a small amount of high GI food, there will only be a small rise in the blood sugar levels because of the amount of food which is low intake. Thus, it is important to know the amount of carbohydrate being consumed in each and every meal and also associate to its GI index. When foods with various GIs are combined, the total GI of the meal will depend on the amount of each of these foods and their individual glycemic index values. Now, when we see what affects the glycemic index of a food, it is the fat and fiber that tends to lower the glycemic index of food. As a general rule, the more cooked or processed foods have a higher GI. However, this is not always true. Below, we have few examples of other factors that can affect to the GI, the glycemic index of a food. For example, the ripeness and storage time. The more ripened a fruit is or a vegetable is, the higher is the GI. Processing, when the juice has higher GI than the whole fruit, mashed potatoes has a higher GI than the whole baked potatoes, stone ground whole wheat bread has a lower GI than the whole wheat bread, and a little more GI with the refined maida bread. And cooking method also plays a vital role. That is, how long we cook a food is also influences the glycemic index of foods. And also the variety, the converted long grain white rice has a lower glycemic index than a brown rice, but short grain white rice has a higher glycemic index than the brown rice. Thus, these play a vital influence on the glycemic index of the foods. And now when we see what is the importance of this glycemic index, the higher the rise in the glucose levels in the bloodstream, the more insulin is produced to store it. Over time, this can lead to a higher insulin levels that can result in inflammation, weight gain and resistance to insulin's ability to store more sugar in the bloodstream. The end result will be that it may progress into type 1 diabetes mellitus. And when we look into the role of glycemic index, especially during diabetes mellitus and also in the management of the condition diabetes, glycemic index is critical to health and longevity as well as preserving the brain function. As we consume foods that raise blood sugar, we burn on a system that allows the sugar in the blood to be transported out to the bloodstream and then into the cells, which brings the level of sugar in blood back down to the normal. Insulin is a key hormone manufactured in the pancreas that controls this entire process. As blood sugar levels rise following the consumption of a particular food during a meal, the pancreas senses itself the elevation and immediately starts churning out the insulin to the blood glucose levels back down to the normal. As blood sugar levels rise following the consumption of a particular food, the pancreas senses its elevation and immediately starts churning out the insulin to bring the pancreas binds to receptors on the surface of the cells and essentially unlocks these gates, allowing the sugar access to the cell's interior. The glycemic index, which not just reflects high blood sugar levels and its rise after a particular meal is consumed, but also incorporates the length of time the sugar remains elevated and has an important implication in terms of pancreas function and the insulin it secretes into the blood streams. Obviously, the higher the glycemic index of a particular food, the harder the pancreas will have to work to produce insulin to get the blood sugar, the blood glucose levels under control. Insulin's role is vast to ask the cells to help out by extracting the sugar from the bloodstream, and when high sugar, the high glycemic index foods are persistently consumed. Ultimately, the cell begins to become less responsive to the insulin signal, thus weakening their ability to help lower their blood glucose levels. Someone with diabetes should aim to avoid peaks in the blood glucose levels in their bloodstreams. One way to achieve this is by eating more of the low glycemic foods that are slowly absorbed into the pancreas, and slow or gradual rise in their blood sugar may happen. It is important to still have a healthy, balanced meal which has plenty of seasonal vegetables and flavors, healthy fats, and lose weight if needed. And the main aim is to one low glycemic carbohydrate food at each meal or at each snack. Now, when we talk into the role of glycemic index in weight management, those who are trying to shed a few kilograms want to manage their appetite and still feel to manage their appetite and satisfy on a reduced kilojoule, that is the calorie intake. Low glycemic index foods helps to keep you full for a longer time and so starve off hunger pangs, meaning eating less is much easier. The dietary replacement of saturated fats by carbohydrates with a low glycemic index may be much beneficial for weight management, whereas substitution with refined high glycemic index carbohydrates is not at all possible. Lowering the glycemic load of the diet appears to be an effective method of promoting the weight loss and also thereby improve the lipid profiles, and can be simply incorporated into a person's lifestyle. Now, next, when we look into the examples of the foods, now the foods with low glycemic index, that is 55 or less, which are commonly the breads made of rye, wheat, barley, and breakfast cereals like all brands, fiber rich cereals, oat bran, rice bran, and cereal grains, cooked cereal grains, whole wheat kernels, buckwheat, brown rice, semolina. And when we look into the different dairy products, the normal non-fat yogurts, plain low fat or non-fat milk, soya milk, are all foods with low glycemic foods. And when we look into the fruits, the category of fruits that come under the low glycemic index category is apples, berries, cherries, grapes, grapefruits, oranges, peach, pears, plums, and dried apricots too is added into this low index category. And when we look into the large group of legumes, it includes chickpeas, lentils, black-eyed beans, peas, black beans, lima beans, kidney beans, soya beans, moong dal, all come under the low glycemic index category. And apart from this, when we talk about vegetables such as asparagus, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, carrots, cauliflower, dark green leafy vegetables, eggplants, mushrooms, the spinach, tomatoes, tomato juice, all come under the category of low glycemic index foods. Snack foods include peanuts, almonds, walnuts, nuts and seeds, which always have a protective role in the human system along with this low glycemic index. And when we look into sugars, the fructose and lactose are the two sugar category that is categorized in the low glycemic index category. Now, when we look into the list of foods choices with moderate glycemic index, which is between 59 and 69, includes whole wheat bread, whole grain breads, rolled barley, basmati rice, the long grain rice, cornmeal, low fat, non-fat fruits, yogurts, apple juice which is unsweetened without any additional sugars, banana which is unripened stage, mango, pineapple, papaya, orange juices which is also unsweetened, the grapefruit juices, carrot juices, beets, green peas, sweet corns, yam, sweet potatoes, all come under the category of moderate GI foods. And now when we look into the category of sugars, sucrose comes under this moderate GI, which is in between the low and the high category foods. And the last one, when we categorize the foods with high GI, which is 70 or higher, and this cautions the persons to limit the intake of such foods, and this includes white bread and also the processed wheat bread sometimes, gluten-free white bread, rice bread, and also nuts like grape nuts, Rice Krispies, corn flakes, bran flakes, corn bran, total shredded wheat, puffed wheat, corn pops, and also white rice, quick cooking rice, parboiled rice, all come under the category of the high GI foods. The cranberry juice, which is made as a cocktail, canned dates, raisins, watermelon, all these are categorized as foods with high index. And also when we talk about the pastas, noodles, spaghettis are also under this category of high GI foods. Instant potatoes, French fries, winter squashes, pumpkins, potato chips, waters, soda, crackers, rice cakes, and breakfast cereals, bars and cookies also under this category of high GI. And when we look into the category of sugars, it is the maltose, glucose, and honey which is categorized as high glycemic. Now, so far we have seen the details on glycemic index of foods as such. Now we will move on to see the second part, which is the glycemic load, what happens into the human system. The glycemic load is the actual amount of an insulin stimulating carbohydrate consumed multiplied by the glycemic index for that carbohydrate. A healthy diet is obtained through insulin moderation, which can best be achieved by consuming primarily the low density carbohydrates that also will have a low glycemic index. Therefore, glycemic load is calculated with this formula shown here, which is the glycemic index multiplied by the amount of carbohydrates consumed divided by 100. The purpose of including the glycemic load values was to allow the comparisons of the likely glycemic effect of the realistic portion sizes of the different foods. Now, when we look into the following comparisons, for example, pasta 1 cup, the glycemic index is rated as 59 and glycemic load appears 3068. And when we look into the apples, 1 apple contains a glycemic index of 54 and also appears with a glycemic load of 972. When we look into the consumption of broccoli, 2 cups of cooked broccoli, it has a glycemic load of 150. Even with a similar glycemic index, the pasta generates 20 times as much insulin response as a cup of broccoli. And hence it is always a good choice of the cooked broccoli than going for the pastas. The glycemic load is categorized similar way to the glycemic index as high glycemic load, which is more than 20, moderate glycemic load, which rates between 11 and 19, and low glycemic load, which is less than or equal to 10. The following are good rules of thumb about glycemic load. The first one is keep your glycemic load below 3000 in any of the meals. Each meal should not go beyond 3000. You can see that if you have a Coca-Cola or any beverage, very rarely you have exceeded that glycemic load with your beverage alone. The more processed a food, the higher is the glycemic load. Boiled beans have much lower glycemic load than the same volume of canned beans. And when you make any bean into soup, the glycemic load skyrockets because the prolonged cooking breaks down the cell walls of the bean, making it easier for the body to digest it into simple sugars for absorption. As I conclude to this glycemic load, it is the concept that makes it clear why consuming most of your carbohydrates from high quality vegetables is the key to maintain insulin levels with the appropriate zone without any much peaks. Now let us move on to see the last section, which is the non-nutritive sweeteners. Non-nutritive sweeteners are zero or low caloric alternatives to nutritive sweeteners such as the table sugar. These sweeteners can be added to both hot and cold beverages and some can be used for baking too. Non-nutritive sweeteners are much sweeter than sugar, so only small amounts are needed for use. They provide fewer calories per gram than sugar because they are not completely absorbed by your digestive system. The Food and Drug Administration (FDA) has approved the use of following non-nutritive sweeteners like aspartame, neotame, saccharin, sucralose and stevia. Now let us see a few of these in detail. When we look into the details of aspartame, it has 4 calories per gram. However, because it is 200 times sweeter than the table sugar. Aspartame is used in very small amounts, thus adding almost no calories to the foods and beverages. As a result, when aspartame is substituted for calorie-containing sweeteners, total calorie in foods and beverages are significantly reduced. And aspartame is not very heat stable. Therefore, it is not recommended for use in baking or any cooking methods that require extended exposure in higher temperatures. Although there is no safety concerns with doing so, the flavor breaks down, reducing the sweetness of the final product, and aspartame is typically used in prepared foods and beverages that do not require heating during preparation. Aspartame can also be added to a cup of coffee or tea when it is ready. Because the sweetener contributes phenylalanine, products containing aspartame must bear a warning label for people with the inherited disease, the phenylketonuria, which is PKU. People with PKU are unable to dispose of any excess phenylalanine, and this must be kept as a caution. Now, when we look into the next non-nutritive sweetener, cyclamate, in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration (FDA) banned the sale of cyclamate in 1969 after lab tests in rats. The animal studies involving 10:1 mixture of cyclamate and saccharin that at levels comparable to the humans ingesting 550 cans of diet soda per day caused bladder cancer, a disease which can lead to particularly susceptible individuals. Cyclamate are still used as sweeteners in many parts of the world, including Europe. It is 30 times sweeter than sucrose, and it tastes much like sugar and is heat stable, which is another advantage of this non-nutritive sweetener. Now, when we look into the next non-nutritive sweetener, which is the saccharin. Saccharin is the oldest of all the sweeteners in the market, and saccharin is sodium orthobenzene. The sulfonamide or the calcium salt, it is heat stable and suitable for use in cooking and as well in baking, and also as an addition to beverages and foods. It can be synthesized with relatively few impurities and is inexpensive when used in combination with aspartame or the cyclamate. Sweetness is enhanced and the bitterness is reduced here. And the other sweetener available in market is the stevia. Stevia sweeteners are natural ones, zero caloric source of sweetness. They are composed of highly purified steviol glycosides, which are extracted from the sweetest part of the stevia plant. Like other low calorie sweeteners, they are intense sweeteners, meaning a very small amount is required and is enough to achieve the desired sweetness. Stevia sweeteners are 200 to 300 times sweeter than the table sugar. It is also important to note that food and beverages containing stevia sweeteners may contain additional calories and also food components, and consumers should read the product label when adding new food or beverage to their diet. Now, when we look into the next non-nutritive sweetener, which is the sucralose, it is a chlorinated sugar that is about 600 times as sweet as the table sugar, and it is produced from sucrose when 3 chlorine atoms replace 3 hydroxyl groups, and it is used in beverages, the frozen desserts, chewing gums, baked goods and other foods, and it is also heat stable. Unlike other artificial sweeteners, it is stable when heated to higher temperatures and can therefore be used in baked and fried foods too. The FDA approved Sucralose in 1998 and it is also a long use sweetener in the market. The sucralose is a chemical derivative of sucrose, the table sugar. Sucralose is very versatile and it can be used as a replacement for sugar in cooking and as well in baking and used with sugar in recipes. It is found in many low calorie foods and beverages available in the market. Now when we look into the next artificial sweetener, Acesulfame Potassium, it is a synthetic derivative of acetoacetic acid and it is not metabolized in the body and is excreted unchanged. It has little undesirable taste after it is used. The acesulfame potassium, which is ACE, is 200 times sweeter than the sucrose, that is the common sugar available with us, and as sweet as aspartame, about 2/3 as sweet as saccharin and 1/3 as sweet as sucralose. Like saccharin, it has a slightly bitter aftertaste, especially with higher concentrations. The Kraft Foods has patented the use of sodium ferulate to mask the acesulfame's aftertaste. This combination is blended with the sweeteners and usually the aspartame and sucralose are usually combined, which gives more sucrose-like taste, whereby each sweetener masks the other aftertaste and also exhibits a synergistic effect. Now, when we look into the other non-nutritive sweetener, which is the Neotame, it is also used in low-calorie foods and beverages available in the markets and especially in the processed foods. But to a lesser extent than from other sweeteners, it is about 7,000 to 13,000 times sweeter than the sugar. Therefore, it is a derivative of amino acids phenylalanine and aspartic acid and has a huge role in the foods prepared in the markets. Lead acetate is sometimes called the sugar of lead. It is an artificial sugar substitute made from lead that is of historical interest because of its widespread use in the past, such as by ancient Romans. The use of lead acetate as a sweetener eventually produced lead poisoning in any individual ingesting it as a habit. Lead acetate was abandoned as a food additive throughout the world after the high toxicity of lead compounds became very much apparent. Now, when we look into this another component, ALITAME, it is dipeptide based amide and has a sweet taste similar to sugar. It is more than 2,000 times sweeter than sucrose. FDA approval for ALITAME and Cyclamate is still pending. As a conclude to this module, non-nutritive sweeteners or artificial sweeteners that are available in the market are also commonly referred to as a key ingredient for dieting products, such as they provide a significant sweetening effect without adding carbohydrates or calories. Since the 1950s, these sweeteners have been approved for use in number of dietetic and low-calorie foods available in the market and has a vast role in the management of disease. The Food and Drug Administration FDA has established an acceptable daily intake, which is ADI, for artificial sweeteners, and ADI is the amount of sweetener that individuals can safely consume without any harm each day over the course of lifetime without any adverse effects, and it includes a 100-fold safety factor which is based on body weight and includes a very large safety margin. So hence these topics are very much useful to you. Hope you learned this module. Thank you.